Ties to a cult may have led to a fatal shooting in Monroe County. A woman is now in custody for shooting her boyfriend in the head.
Stephen and Barbara met online through the Sherry Shriner group.
I know exactly what happened that night. She pulled him by the hair and pulled him up on his knees. And her face contorted and that demon started manifesting in her.
They look like people, but they can transform into a reptilian form.
Do you believe that?
Yeah.
Stephen was angry and wanted to die because he got kicked out of that cult.
I felt like killing myself over this. I felt like killing myself because of her.
This went down because Sherry Shriner manipulated Steve Mineo and my ex-wife Barbara. That's what happened.
5 years before Stephen died, there was another follower of Sherry Shriner's that had a tragic death. Her name was Kelly Pengilly.
Sherry's generated over $774,000 over a 10-year period.
I need your financial support. I need your help. I need warriors and countries to stand up. Go to my website, OregonBlasters.com. It's money well spent.
About a case that happened in northeastern Pennsylvania over the weekend. A 32-year-old man was killed, shot in the head, according to this story from the Daily Wire, after he allegedly made the request to die for the sake of a bizarre belief in the reptilian nature of his cult leader. And so we thought we would reach out to the woman who is being called the cult leader. This is Sherry Shriner with us on WILK. Hi, Sherry.
Hi, how you doing?
Doing well. First of all, before we get into this specific incident, are you a cult or not?
No, I'm not a cult. I'm just a Christian. I love the Lord. I serve the Lord. They want to make all Christians look bad and crazy, call them all cults.
Right after Stephen was killed, Sherry Shriner was on a bunch of different radio shows. And I think that she thought this was her big chance to really get her word out. I think that she thought that when Kelly killed herself as well. I think that she sees these tragedies as a way to improve her reach and to prove that she was right all along.
According to Barbara Rogers, Stephen thought that you were actually a reptilian.
I know, I thought that was hilarious. Interestingly, we called her a reptile, so she's calling me back a reptile. She is a practicing Wiccan witch, and there's a lot of other things that gets involved with her. This isn't her first time she's killed somebody, and that's why I hope the police investigate this.
Sherry was saying, I know that she's killed 4 other people, you know, on the real radio, not on her made-up little blog thing. And the lady said, you can't say that for real. None of that is true.
You know, you have to be careful when you say stuff like that.
I know.
Sherry.
Well, they need to investigate her because she has a past in Kentucky that's very well hidden, and 2 men missing. Anybody that could hold up a gun to some kid's head and pull the trigger is not new at it.
A Florida woman will face a trial on charges she murdered her boyfriend last month in Monroe County. 42-year-old Barbara Rogers was in court for a preliminary hearing this afternoon in Toby Hanna.
When you tell somebody that their mother was involved in a death, there's no easy way to say those things. You sit down and you say what happened. And there's a lot of crying, and there's a lot of hugging, and there's just a lot of being there for each other. And I think that's where we were at. What's going on with the fire, dude? We were kind of kept in the dark. No police ever talked to me. You know, and I'd see something on YouTube or something of the arraignment or whatever, and that was it. That was, you know, local Poconos news. You know, that's what we had.
Rogers says Mineo asked her to kill him because he had gotten threats from an online cult. Rogers faces 1 count of criminal homicide, which was sent on to a higher court this morning. She remains in the Monroe County prison without bail.
I was in contact with Detective Bray at the beginning, and he was asking me about my mother and, you know, her mental illness, and I was like, is she taking her medication? Make sure that she's doing that. And he was like, well, this is, you know, it's just not adding up. He wasn't very nice about it. He told me, he was like, you know, dropped the death sentence phrase. He's like, well, you know, she might get the death penalty.
Alina had to deal with a lot of stuff. She had to deal with going to the crime scene and picking up the things from their apartment.
When I drove there, you know, a week after the shooting, I was just like looking around, and of course it had been like tossed by the police, you know, looking for evidence. And I think Steve's family had gone in and taken some items, you know. The room smelled like her. I could just feel her like lingering, and it was so weird. Like, this is where she's been. The life that she had with Steven, studio apartment, guns, violence, conspiracy, uncertainty. I mean, the things that what kind of life is that? And why is that life better than the one she could have had with me?
Have you ever seen a reptilian?
In person, no.
Okay.
I've gotten phone calls with the hissing.
Who's that? Do they? I mean, you have caller ID. Do you know who they are?
Actually, it's just a weird thing of numbers, and they call and they give me death threats and stuff. When you take on Satan's kingdom, it's going to come at you full force, and it has.
It is difficult to conceive that anybody in their right mind could be a follower of Sherry Shriner, where she's contending she was in heaven, that she could tell alien reptiles from humans. There's no part of it that makes sense. And yet it was a driving factor in this whole case.
In July of 2017, I was contacted by Barbara's family and told about Barbara's situation, and I was asked to represent Barbara, and Mr. Galloway and I were doing the criminal work together, and we began to represent Barbara.
There's no question that there were people saying that she was a reptile, and there's probably no question that Stephen pushed back against that. First thing we did was drive up there and speak to Barbara. We met with her in the prison there, and my first impression was how fragile she was. As I said to Jeff one day, she's like a frightened rabbit. So it was obvious that she was very, very nervous and scared, and rightly so. She had serious mental health issues, and I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Her involvement was an accident. She never wanted the gun to go off. And the accident started and was precipitated by Stephen's desire to take his own life.
We both thought that that was a picture of somebody who was not guilty, and we were going to work at proving that, period.
911, where's your emergency?
My boyfriend, he had a gun, and he grabbed me, and he told me, here, press this trigger.
It's very unusual that we get that 911 call where somebody confesses to a crime that they committed.
And I pulled it on accident, but it's because he had his hands around it, and he squeezed it.
The impressions that we got were that Barbara had actually pulled the trigger on Stephen Mineo.
On surface, this looks like one of those cases that looks fairly easy. The fact that we already had a good suspect and she was there and our guys had her was a good thing. So when I arrive on scene, the first thing that I noted was the big hole in the center of his forehead. It's a a star-like pattern that was around the hole. Some of the most rudimentary police trainings, they teach you that is a sign of a contact wound, which means that that gun was right up against his forehead.
And it was in a position that is not typical of a suicide-type shot. It's more typical of someone else pulling the trigger.
And it gave the appearance that he was sitting there and executed, looking up at the barrel of a gun.
I think they went down that path, and that was the narrative that they spun, that she intentionally killed him.
I think the police saw it as an open and shut case, and I think it may have affected the way that they proceeded. The biggest thing that the police missed at first was the cartridge was still in the chamber of the gun. It didn't get expelled. And so they get to the crime scene, and there's no cartridge, and there's no blood on the shooter. And so they're like, she clearly threw out the cartridge, washed off the blood, and then called us.
I think it's awfully hard for detectives not to jump to conclusions and work toward that conclusion.
Yeah, put your hands the other way.
But I think they concluded that she intended it, and they weren't going to be satisfied with anything less than that.
The evidence itself speaks for itself. You know, her first story coming out of Pennsylvania right over there was that he was being bullied and harassed and he wanted her to kill him. The whole story, I'm just a frail little girl, and you know, it just falls apart.
Well, this woman, Barbara Rogers, she originally was from Florida, and somehow she came to the Poconos. Do you know when these two met and what the nature of their relationship is, as you understand it?
He met her online. He didn't know her very long. And he started telling us that he found the woman of his dreams.
Sherry Shriner launched her Patreon the day that Barbara's trial started. It's still up and running. I joined her Patreon for 1 month, and you know, she was going to provide this exclusive insight to this murder.
She had several profiles on Facebook that she was denying that was hers, that I knew was hers. I even had a crime scene detective, retired, go through the 2 different profiles and state, this is the same person.
Now, why would you go to that length, though, Sherry? Why would you go to that length to find out who she was?
I love Steve, and I just could tell you, it's a mother's instinct, whatever you want to call it, that this woman was no good. This girl was no good.
A trial is underway for a Florida woman charged with murdering her boyfriend in Monroe County. Opening statements began this morning in the trial of 44-year-old Barbara Rogers. Rogers says Mineo asked her to kill him because he had gotten threats from an online cult.
Once they started getting this kind of attention, everything about Barbara's case was viewed through this prism of Sherry Shriner's reptile cult. Even if it's just you're the type of person who believes this crazy thing, who knows what you're capable of?
You go back to the scene, you have the victim laying on the ground with a gunshot wound point blank to the middle of his forehead, so close that there's burns around the wound, there's the star pattern in his forehead.
My name's Andrew Krekel. I'm an assistant district attorney here at the Monroe County District Attorney's Office. And in the prosecution of Barbara Rogers, I was second chair. I think it was a Saturday morning. I woke up and I was looking at articles, and there was an article in the Daily Beast. And I forwarded that to Mike Mancuso, our first assistant, who handles all our homicides. From that, he asked me if I wanted to help him with it.
And for you, like, how many homicides had you worked on before this?
This was my first.
The prosecution wanted to show that Barbara must have done this on purpose. And they wanted to make sure that they put her away for life.
We didn't know how much we wanted to make the cult part of the case. We couldn't ignore it, but you don't want to overwhelm the jury with it or distract them with it, because you know it's not funny. Someone was murdered. You know, like when you put a gun to someone's forehead in a position like this, you know, that's murder.
name is Emmanuel Capelson. I'm a firearms, ballistics, and use of force expert. And I worked as an expert witness on behalf of Barbara Rogers in the homicide trial. In this case, I went to the police department that was holding the evidence. I looked at the gun, the magazine, looked at the autopsy report and photographs, looked at the scene photographs, scene diagrams, for the purpose of seeing whether I could offer an opinion about whether Barbara Rogers' version of the events was probable. So this simulates Barbara Rogers holding the pistol with her finger on the trigger, the deceased putting his hands over hers, pulling the trigger, and now I'm going to take the gun away to show that firing in this way leaves the empty shell casing in the chamber, just as it was in Barbara Rogers' case. So I formed an opinion that this shot was fired with the muzzle in contact with the deceased's forehead, and that if the gun was held at all by Barbara Rogers, it was held by her with the deceased's own hands over her hands, pushed the muzzle against his own forehead, put his own finger or fingers over her trigger finger, and pressed her finger against the trigger. So in effect, he fired the gun into his own skull. And that would account for the contact wound to the forehead and possibly the shell casing still being left in the pistol's chamber. Although this case was only a few years ago, it stands out in my memory as one of the more unusual cases, with cults, with aliens, with the details of the situation.
Mr. Capelson was our key witness. I think he confirmed Barbara's version of events and even demonstrated Barbara's version of events to the jury.
Our gun expert from the state police just explained that gun gets out of battery if it's too much pressure is put on it, and it makes sense that it would be right, the loose contact or light contact. Is respected as Manny is, and as much as he knows about Glocks, I don't know if the jury was necessarily taken with their demonstration. It's not the way it happened, so.
I would rather be hated for being right than loved for being wrong. Because look at all the friends he was with there towards the end. Oh, they loved Barb. Cheering her and Stevie on. Go Barb, go Barb. Oh, we love Barb. Oh, Sherry, she's the meanie, she's the monster. She's a false prophet. Really, who was right? You called me the false prophet and I was the one trying to protect him and keep him alive?
Do you believe that there is an underworld of reptilians who are infiltrating high levels of power, including Hollywood and also politics, right?
Oh, sure. I've been posting YouTube videos on my sites for years. You can go to YouTube and type in reptilian shapeshifter, celebrity shapeshifters, celebrity vampires. I mean, it's just all coming out. They can't hide it anymore. With the merging of the dimensions, people are beginning to see these beings exist in people. They're shape-shifting, they're morphing.
Sherry, to most people who don't really think like this all sounds pretty crazy.
Well, when you learn it as you go, because that's what I've had to do, because I didn't grow up in this kind of stuff, it all makes sense. I'm calling a spade a spade. I've been exposing this stuff for 20 years. So who's the crazy one?
What about Sherry is worth following? What about Sherry is worth listening to? And the answer's nothing. She is just some crank sitting in her office spewing garbage on the internet. Beginning, middle, and end.
Day 2 of a trial for a Florida woman charged with murdering her boyfriend in Monroe County.
44-year-old Barbara Rogers walked into the courtroom today for the second day of trial.
The jury was played an interrogation video showing Rogers speaking to police officers.
What really stands out to me about her condition during that statement was just the fatigue. The interrogation went on for over 6 hours, and she was obviously was so fatigued and so sad and so confused, which is very consistent with somebody being through a traumatic event.
Barbara was useless as a witness. The police ask her for her story, and she tells it poorly several times.
I know you went through a traumatic event tonight, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that. You're not under arrest, okay? You're in a police station.
Yeah, Pokemon Regional Police, they're, you wouldn't necessarily think, because it's kind of rural up there. It's, you know, there's a lot of trees and woods and all that sort of stuff, but they're very good. They're very, their detectives have always been very good.
I know that you had your hands on a gun when it went off today, right?
I did. He put my hands there. He goes, here, put them here. And then it's like, he just goes, I want you to shoot it. He just put my hands on it and said, I want you to shoot it at me.
The night that I got arrested was a blur. I was in a lot of shock. I mean, I was just disoriented when this whole thing happened.
He said, point it at me. He goes, here you go, take this into your hands. I want you to point this at me.
The police thought that Stephen didn't have his hands on the gun. He couldn't have had his hands on the gun.
Just a little bit that I saw at the scene, it doesn't look like his hands were on the gun when it went off. So can you explain that to me again?
The defense case hung almost exclusively on the testimony of Emmanuel Capelson. What the Glock expert was able to show was that Stephen's hands were likely on the gun. I think that if the cops had known, they may have gone about their interrogation differently.
You told 911 that you both had your hands on the gun, and we know that that's not the truth now either. That you had the gun in your hand all by himself.
Do you remember what you told 911? I listened to it. That's another reason why I'm having a whole bunch of problems sitting here swallowing what you're telling us.
Well, we both had our hands on the gun. And, you know, I didn't want to hold it. I was reluctant to even grab it, but, you know, he put it in my hands.
It's fascinating when the detective finally gets her to admit that there was no way his hands could have been on the gun.
Well, he handed it to me.
Okay, so he hands you the gun.
Mm-hmm.
Now you have the gun in your hand.
Yes.
Seeing him push her and push her and push her until she says, yeah, his hands weren't on the gun.
He's not touching it anymore, right?
No, his hands were off of it.
Okay, so the only person's hands on the gun are yours at this point, right?
Yes.
She changed her story so many times because they insisted that she do that. They weren't happy with her story.
He asked me to point it at him.
No, we already went over that. That's not what happened. Because you told me, we specifically talked about that. You said he asked you to point at something. He asked you to point the gun, but not at himself.
He could have said, point it beside me or point it beside my head.
They were just guessing. She was saying nonsense, and they were guessing at what could have happened. And sometimes she said yes, and sometimes she said no. And if they guessed the same thing a couple of times, she'd say yes to keep them from guessing it anymore.
I think it was pressed against his forehead. I think you pulled it on purpose. In fact, I know that you pulled it on purpose. I don't think that when, like, you were planning this, I don't think this is something that you necessarily planned on doing, but I think that's exactly what happened, correct?
It might, yes, that could be right, yeah.
It was just being coerced by these two detectives and then them trying to get me to say something.
What she told them was not satisfactory to them, and they just kept going after and going after and going after.
That's nonsense. There was no coercion at all. The way Detective Borman conducts that interview it was mind-blowing for me of how the opposite of what you see on TV he was. It's not like, you know, trying to hammer them, you tell me the truth right now. It's just, let's have a conversation about what happened.
When you're dealing with a woman who's in these circumstances with this background, etc., and you keep it going 6.5 hours because accident keeps coming up and coming up and coming up and coming up, and you're not happy with that, you're going to wear somebody down. I don't care who it is.
You're not being truthful. You're not, and so that bothers me. You just killed this guy who you tell us you love, right? You were in love with him? Were you in love with him?
Yes, I love him.
You
I
just
would
killed
never
him.
kill
You just killed him. You took his life. And you're, as a matter of fact, sitting there trying to come up with a story that makes you look better. There's no way to make you look better here. You did what you did. The only thing you can do is to clear your conscience and be truthful about it.
They wanted to blame the whole thing on me. They had their minds made up that this was a murder.
Oh God, I would never kill him.
But you did kill him.
Now, why would I make up a story like that nobody wants to believe? I mean, I knew they weren't going to believe me. I knew, I'm going to get arrested this night. I kind of foresaw it, but that's all I can say happened because that's what happened.
She tried to tell them every way from Sunday that this was an accident. I asked the jury when they listened how many times she would say the word accident, and it was 24. She told them 24 times that this was an accident, and they simply refused to believe it.
I picked it up and I just squeezed it.
On purpose.
Yes, it was on purpose.
If the question is it coarse? Of course it is. When you're Barbara Rogers and you're as fragile as an eggshell, it's really a disaster.
Oh, please, I beg of you for mercy. If you would bring Stephen back, I'll do anything for him. I'll stop drinking.
I thought that I was having a hallucination the whole time I was in there. That I was just stuck in a bad dream and I just could not wake up from it. They arrested me, charged me with criminal homicide. I've been incarcerated ever since that night. Prison is not the right place for me. I haven't been able to get over what happened with Stephen here. I haven't been able to mourn him correctly because I'm being blamed for his death. I don't belong here. I really don't.
How does prison impact your bipolar disorder?
Well, they don't treat it at all in prison. They don't treat it. So I have to deal with it while I'm in here on my own. It's going to be with me my whole life, most likely. Because I still have symptoms of it, I still have the symptoms, so it's pretty much with me for life.
I couldn't ask my mom over the phone, tell me what happened, the truth, just because she could have incriminated herself, I went to the trial. I knew that she would need some help and some support, and I just really wanted to find out what happened. Find out the truth,
We called some of Barbara's family. I thought it was important for the jury to know a little bit more about Barbara.
That was a difficult situation. I thought it was just going up there to defend her character. And they specifically asked me, does she know how to fire a 9mm pistol? And I said, absolutely not.
They claimed at trial that she'd never been trained on handguns. I don't know if that's true or not. It seems unlikely. It's been 8 years in the military. They don't ever teach anything about handguns. The fact that she had, she demonstrated that shooting stance, I know I keep going back to that, but it was important to us because how would she know to do that?
Handed me the gun.
It's a proper stance, not something she just made up. So for her to do that, to know to do that, it seemed like she had to have some idea of what she was doing.
Which is not true. It's absolutely false. She had fired a rifle because she had to qualify with a rifle. She had never fired pistols in the service. She had never fired this pistol. My secretary has as much ability with a firearm as Barbara does.
First of all, she used her military issue .45 Glock. She was in the military. She retired from the military, I believe, or she got out early on a pension. She had no problem shooting him. She pointed it right to his head and blew his head off.
At one point, Sherry Schreiner told Steve that she was a super soldier and that she had been trained by the military to destroy him.
She was in the military, 15, 20 years. As you know, they chip implant their soldiers so that when they leave the military, they can activate their chip implants and control them to do what they want them to do.
A super soldier, she was a supply clerk. She barely qualified with her weapon at the range. There was no super soldier in her. She was Barbara, mother of 3, you know?
I worked in an office, inventorying stuff and ordering stuff, you know, just office work.
Her job was to work in the logistics and running the Army, and she did well at that, but for the mental health problems that developed when she was stationed in Germany.
I came down with bipolar disorder. I was always coming in late to work, and I would be disoriented. My bosses, they all noticed it, that I wasn't functioning the way I used to, and that, you know, I wasn't able to work. See, I was still having symptoms even after I took the medication. I was still having a very hard time functioning, even with it.
I knew that she was mentally ill, and I knew that this was a big problem, and I knew she needed help. And at that point, all I could do was pray for her.
We found out that she was discharged from the military for mental health reasons and that she'd attempted to kill herself.
Do you take medicine for your bipolar? Have you taken it regularly? Are you up to date on your medicine?
I think sometimes I skip a few days, but yeah.
Come on in.
In the trial, we got to hear the time where her interrogators left the room, and we got to hear her talk a lot. And that is the one thing that makes me understand that she's innocent and that she didn't maliciously murder Stephen.
Oh, please, Jesus Christ, my Lord and Savior, I don't do anything. Bring them back from the dead.
We called them the whisperings because she was just whispering to herself, but you could make out most of it. It was like she was trying to convince herself that she didn't do it, or that she did it because he wanted her to.
What if I marry him, take his last name, we could legally be together, I'll do that. I'll do anything for him to come back.
One of the things she said is, please God, bring him back. If you bring him back, I'll quit drinking.
I'll stop drinking. I'll give it up all for him.
And that just blew my mind. It's just how out of touch with consequences.
I'll drink only 1 or 2 drinks.
You see the mental health problem she has when you watch that. We thought the jury should be entitled to know that she had bipolar disorder, which would reduce her culpability in this case.
We confirmed Barbara's diagnosis of bipolar disorder, and the bipolar disorder was the same disorder that she was honorably discharged from the military.
The judge ruled that we could not put that into evidence unless we were willing to concede that she was guilty of at least 3rd degree. We could not and did not do that.
If she walked away, not only would Stephen's family hit the roof, I would too. She should just be in the electric chair somewhere.
Has law enforcement contacted you from Pennsylvania yet?
No.
It's interesting, isn't it?
I haven't talked to anybody. They have the script. They want to go with the script that Sherry Schreiner's a reptile and she's a cult and we're going to blame it on her. They've done this before. This is round 2 for me.
We didn't know if Sherry would be a witness to actually testify in trial, but decided we probably should talk to Sherry. Try to get as much background on at least the dispute that people were having with Stephen and Barbara online, just to get an idea of how much that might have contributed to him being stressed out or any tensions between him and Barbara, those sorts of things. Because the jury wants to hear motive. I think we all want to know why things happen. And that's one of the things we want to talk to Sherry Schreiner about. She might have been able to fill those gaps in. More information, the better. Usually is the case for us. Her email address was pretty easy to find on one of her websites. I emailed her expecting to never hear from her. She emailed me back, I think, the same day.
I don't care what she said. I don't care if she said she was an eyewitness to the shooting. She's eminently attackable. I mean, she said that the killing was proof that Barbara was, in fact, an alien reptile. And honestly, the prison, I think, would have discovered if she was a reptile.
We set up a meeting to meet her in Youngstown, which is not terribly far away from where she lived. And then she just kind of went silent.
They want to take this to trial, it's going to come out. They're messing with the wrong person. I'm not afraid of any of them.
So filling in the gap of motive was important to us.
There was absolutely no motive. There was no greed. There was no jealousy. There was no abuse. There was nothing. There was nothing in the history of this couple that had a motive of any way, shape, or form.
It made sense to me that she would end this relationship somehow and then just leave. She ended up not doing that, but not leaving, but she ended the relationship.
What they tried to do during the course of the trial was that Barbara was tired of him. She wanted to discard him. And that simply wasn't true. There was no evidence of that, but they wanted the jury to make that leap.
I thought what me and Stephen had was a beautiful and good thing. It wasn't something evil or chaotic, despite the fact that all the evidence points to we were a couple in love, that we never argued. They still said that me and him had problems.
Really, one person woke up that day wanting to kill somebody, and it was Stephen Mignon wanting to kill himself.
He was a 14-year follower of Sherry Shriner, who I was shocked to hear that she had not 4 followers or 27 followers, but 5,000 people bought into that crap. And Stephen Mignon was a huge follower of hers. And it wasn't just that he suddenly wasn't in the cult, it was him against 5,000. And that's the reason he was distraught by the whole thing.
That woman really fucked my head up.
The mental torture she gives people, dude, I had suicidal thoughts. I felt like killing myself because of her.
He wanted to commit suicide, he just didn't know how to go about doing it. Stephen was a very religious person, and a lot of people believe that if you commit suicide, you know, you go straight to hell, like in that movie Constantine. Stephen was of that belief, you know, which is why he couldn't bring himself to shoot himself that night. And when he placed the gun into my hands and then guided it to his forehead, it went off.
Prosecution and defense presented their closing arguments in the case. A judge is expected to give jurors their final instructions in the case tomorrow morning.
We were shocked that the judge ruled accident out of the case. We're trying to show accident, they're trying to show it's not accident, and then the jury doesn't get to pass on that.
To not give the jury the option of an accident was very disappointing and unfair, I think, to Barbara.
I mean, they don't want anything that will give me a fair trial. They're against anything to be a fair trial.
Well, we begin tonight with a murder sentence handed down in Monroe County Court. Well, today, Barbara Rogers was sentenced to 15 to 40 years behind bars. She claims the murder was tied to an alien cult.
The verdict of the jury was that Barbara was guilty of third-degree murder, and Barbara received a sentence of 15 to 40 years incarceration.
The defense asked for a more lenient sentence, as Rogers is a mother of 3 with no prior criminal history and military service.
We had hoped that the judge would take that into consideration and give her a sentence that was closer to the bottom end of the standard range as opposed to the top end.
That's too much time, and I've got to keep fighting the whole thing. I can't just settle for that. I can't settle for something like that.
The sentence is awfully high. If we'd have gotten the ruling that we expected on involuntary manslaughter, the most that could have happened to Barbara was 2.5 to 5 years. She's already been in jail 3 years.
Prosecutors asked for the maximum sentence of 20 to 40 years.
We would have liked to have seen her get more, but we understand why the judge did what she did.
What happened to my son is permanent. Her sentence should have been permanent. It was totally unfair.
I don't believe anybody's benefiting from Barbara being incarcerated for the amount of time that she was sentenced. She's not a danger to anybody and does not deserve to be in prison.
As far as I'm concerned, the worst she should have gotten was a manslaughter charge. But really what she should have got was innocent because of insanity.
How I feel about her as a murderer is something I can hardly even touch on, you know? It's insane to me. Now she's gone. It's not. She's gone now. Now it's over. There isn't any hope.
This is the hardest thing I've ever in my life been through. But I know that God allows challenges in a person's life, that it's all to test my faith in Him. And I had to go through something like this to help me grow as a person, you know, to test my faith.
Do you regret what you did?
I was not in control of the situation that happened. I was not the dominating party in that situation.
Stephen, he could be a really impulsive person where he just doesn't think about consequences at all. He just wasn't thinking that if I shot him in the head that night, that I was going to be charged with his murder.
Putting Barbara away for 15 to 40 years, I guess it satisfies our sense that someone did something and got blamed for it. But it doesn't begin to address the damage that Sherry did. And that's really unsatisfying.
I think Stephen Mineo is most responsible for his death, and I think Sherry Shriner had a part in it.
If Sherry Shriner had never existed and he had not gotten into that cult, probably none of this would happen.
Can I say that this would have happened without the cult? No, I don't know. But I don't think it helped.
I think that these are just two lost souls, frankly, you know. They were never capable of dealing with adult life, and they certainly weren't capable of dealing with Sherry Shriner.
I do hold Sherry Shriner responsible because she was the reason why he became suicidal. She started slandering me. She started making up crazy stories about me, and that's what led to him becoming suicidal, you know. Yeah, I do hold her responsible.
Is she ever going to take responsibility for taking out her military .45 and shooting a kid in the head? Is that part of their little script here anywhere? Because they're trying to control this narrative of her. I think they're going to have to realize they have to throw her under the bus and go. Actually, what I was expecting was her to hang herself in her jail cell and then disappear.
Online world is very different from real life.
Facebook created this echo chamber that allowed Sherry to grow faster than she might have otherwise expected.
The more people that watch, the more eyeballs on the screen, the more ads that get consumed, the more money YouTube makes.
You know, you want to get a sense whether she really believed what she said. I feel like if I got to talk